Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. You will hear from my Lions247 colleagues, Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan. A bit later here in the show, we'll give our regular Thursday episode breakdown of the Penn State upcoming matchup, give you our players to watch, our storylines of the week, what we heard coming off of the Penn State practice field on a Wednesday evening, and also our final score predictions for Penn State versus Northwestern. That is the matchup on the slate this week. It's an 11 a.m. local kickoff time in Evanston for us here on the East Coast, a noon kickoff, and Penn State will be looking to get to 5-0 before that bye week hits. They come out of the bye week for homecoming against UMass, and then things get really real on the road at Columbus. They're looking to handle their business as a heavy favorite in this matchup. Thus far, if you hadn't been paying attention, Northwestern on the season 2-2, which when you consider how things were coming out of the summer, it's a pretty good spot. They've actually doubled their win total from 2022 and due in large part to some drama. This past Saturday, rallied from 21 points down against Minnesota to win in overtime. So they've got some momentum coming into this matchup. Of course, the Nittany Lions have plenty of their own momentum, 9 consecutive victories dating back to last year's run. They have looked dominant thus far through nearly a month of the season. But to get better perspective on this Northwestern squad, we bring in Bradley Locker of Inside NU. And if he sounds familiar, that's because we had him on this podcast last year before Northwestern came to town for what was ultimately a slog of a game, Bradley. 17-7, Penn State won that one. 5 turnovers by the Nittany Lions. It was downpouring all afternoon. And at that point, we were still trying to figure out where Penn State's season was going to lead. They were unbeaten at that point, but they didn't have nearly as much benefit of the doubt as they do right now. They're number 6 in the country, but can you give us a little bit of the background on Northwestern and to set the stage for our conversation, where things were on, let's say, August 1st as preseason camp opened up and just a few weeks fresh off the firing of former program star and longtime head coach Pat Fitzgerald?
Definitely. Well, great to be with you again, Tyler. I always love hopping on these podcasts, but it really was an incredibly difficult offseason for Northwestern. And starting with a pure football perspective, it was a Northwestern team that lost Peter Skoronski, Adetomo Adebare, Evan Hull. Those might be names that Penn State fans even recognize because they were pretty highly touted NFL draft prospects, did well at the NFL Combine and the Senior Bowl, or 5th, 4th, and even first-round prospects that Northwestern had to lose and overcome entering this year. And it was a team that, as you mentioned, won one game a year ago, facing a lot of pressure on Pat Fitzgerald if he had stayed as the head coach to go out and execute and win a game in America, something that hadn't happened since October of 2021. And then Fitzgerald was suspended for 2 weeks on July 7th after an external investigation found that hazing occurred in the program, but that Fitzgerald didn't know. Then, of course, groundbreaking reporting by the Daily Northwestern, Inside NU, Wildcat Report, ESPN, and many others uncovered that the level of hazing was beyond, I guess, what you would consider ordinary. It was very clear that it was a long-standing practice at Northwestern, involved sexual coercive behavior, and also there were allegations of racism, too, that were seemingly running rampant within the program. So President Michael Schill made the decision to fire Pat Fitzgerald on July 10th, only 3 days after initially suspending him for 2 weeks. And at that point, David Braun was elevated from the defensive coordinator of Northwestern to the interim head coach. And to provide additional background, this was going to be his first ever FBS job at any level. He has never been a head coach before this season, had never been in the Power 5 or FBS subdivision before this. So talk about a huge jump. But I think Braun has responded very well. He's always handled difficult questions at Big Ten Media Days, in press conferences, in stride, with grace, with humility. And he feels like there's a real direction to this Northwestern team. And through 4 games, I think it's a much more composed team than a lot of us expected to see. It's a team that definitely can at least contend in some games. Of course, the talent differential between a team like Northwestern and Penn State, or Northwestern and Duke, is often so lopsided that there isn't really a great chance for Northwestern to try to compensate for that. But I feel like this is a team that's at least a little scrappy, and unlike in past years, has shown it won't totally just roll over and die.
Well, they opened the season, and it was a pretty clunky performance at Rutgers, a 24-7 loss in Piscataway. It didn't send like they were going to be rallying the troops kind of message out of that game. I watched most of that. They bounced back with a win against UTEP, 38-7 in week 2. Lost to a ranked Duke team by 24 the following week on the road, and then last week they're trailing 31-10. In the fourth quarter, and you think, okay, they're on their way to 1-3. You got Penn State coming to town. The wheels are coming off a bit. And this is the exact spot where I figure most of the nation, including myself, thought with what happened in the summer and where that locker room might be right now, they might just fold up like a tired old dog in that final fourth quarter and say, just get to the finish line. Let's just move on from this. Instead, they storm back, they win in overtime, and here they are at 500 for almost a month of the season. Can you take us through what exactly occurred and what you think it may serve for this program heading into the matchup against Penn State?
I think it was monumental to get to that 500 mark, that 2-2 mark. And as you mentioned, the fact that they had already doubled their win total from a season ago. And it was the first time Northwestern had beaten a Big Ten West opponent in nearly 3 years at home. So Northwestern moved to 2-0 at Ryan Field in that comeback. And I think it was catalyzed really by much stronger defensive play, actually getting off the field on third down and kind of stopping the run once and for all and coming up and needing to make tackles in the hole, which has been a big problem for Northwestern all year. Don't get me wrong. The Wildcats are 5th most in the country in missed tackles per Pro Football Focus. So it's still a big problem. But for kind of the fourth quarter and overtime, Northwestern was definitely more sound. And that department has a really nice plays from Xander Mueller, Coco Azama, kind of downhill to stop the run. And then, of course, Northwestern's offense just got into an absolute rhythm. And Minnesota's secondary, not exactly a really strong unit, but I feel like it was a pretty dominant showing from that Northwestern O. Some good play calling from Mike Bajakian. Quarterback Ben Bryant just got totally in the zone, was really locked in from that fourth quarter onward. And he kind of struggled a little bit in that first half, missed some deep shots. He was fully in stride in that fourth, did not really have any errant throws, any miscues whatsoever. He and Bryce Kurtz were pretty unstoppable. Kurtz had career best 215 yards. That was more than he had all of the 2022 season. And he literally just took over really in the fourth quarter. And I think it was altogether a really sound performance from Bryant. He suffered kind of a bit of a lower leg injury, and people thought, oh, well, he might not even stay in this game. It could have to fall on the shoulders of the junior Brendan Sullivan. But Bryant hung in there, was tough in the pocket, even dealt with some pressure, and Minnesota got to him a little bit, but he was able to respond, execute the game plan. And literally the last play of regulation before kickoff, of course, was a must-score touchdown for Northwestern. He found A.J. Henning wide open on a slant with a little kind of shoulder fake, and I think it just exemplified the clutch element of this team, which has been lacking severely in the last few years, an element of resilience that Braun touched upon in his post-game press conference, that he understands that Northwestern is a team that needs to go out and really persevere through every single quarter, and that was put on display in full effect against Minnesota.
I think when it comes to this offensive attack, and you look at how they want to, go downfield right now and what they're doing through the air, this is as pass-centric as I've seen the Wildcats in what feels like almost a decade, Bradley. I don't think I'm far off from that. And they're doing it with a new quarterback in town, Cincinnati transfer, Ben Bryant. I don't think we've learned much about this rushing attack. I don't know if this is the day for them to try to establish that. So I'd imagine there's going to be a lot of eggs in the basket of Bryant. Can you tell us about how this offense has looked and kind of the responsibility that has been put on the shoulders of this new quarterback in year one on campus?
I would say I think Brian has borne a lot of the responsibility to execute on offense. And when he's been off, Northwestern's offense has really not done very much whatsoever. And in that first game against Rutgers, there were shots down the field that Brian just did not hit on. And he had a really rough day, probably one of the worst performances of his career altogether for a guy who's been a pretty solid quarterback, whether in 4 years at Cincinnati, 1 year at Eastern Michigan. But Brian was probably one of the major reasons why the team lost to the Scarlet Knights. He was inaccurate, had bad pocket movement, and turned the ball over multiple times. But he started to clean it up since then. He was better against UTEP, had more time to throw. Against Duke, it was kind of a game that Northwestern really was not going to win no matter what, just given how strong the Blue Devils are. But Bryant did have some nice moments, also had a turnover in that one. And then against Minnesota, I would say also kind of a mixed bag, although probably lean more toward the positive side of things with the way he responded in the fourth quarter at 396 yards, 4 touchdowns, the first Northwestern quarterback to have 4 touchdown passes in a game since Trevor Siemian in 2013. And I think a lot of it goes back to that fourth quarter and really how he looked in the second half. So I feel like through 4 games, it definitely is a pretty pass-heavy offense, an offense that needs the pass to convert and get in better position. But I feel like Northwestern still wants to be balanced on offense and try to establish the run. It's just the team has either been facing a big hole like it did against Rutgers or Duke, and or has not had much success run blocking, which is it's still a big fundamental issue on this team, how well the offensive line can hold up, especially against a really stout Penn State defensive line. So definitely the receiver room has been pretty solid, whether it's the emergence of Cam Johnson, an Arizona State transfer, Henning, the former Michigan transfer, or Kurtz, who's in his senior season. I feel like there are some solid pass catching options on this offense. And if Bryant is accurate and pretty strong in the pocket, which he's tended to be more over the last 3 weeks, then there could be some options maybe for Northwestern to attack the zones of Penn State a little bit.
I'm curious to see how comfortable he's able to get in that pocket, especially early in the game, because we heard a lot of, I don't want to say similar things, but there was kind of a narrative like with Luke Altmaier at Illinois, a new guy in town doing some exciting things with the offense. But if you got to totally depend on him against this Penn State defense, do the wheels come off? That was the question. On that day, they had 5 turnovers offensively for Illinois. So I think what I'm looking for is what you said. Doesn't appear to be a strong spot, or maybe even an average spot for Northwestern on the offensive line. On the flip side of that, we know the front 7 right now and the way they're starting to peel back some layers with what Manny Diaz wants to do from a personnel standpoint. It's getting a little bit scary from that front 7 for the Nittany Lions. So let's just say it out. Let's just put it out there. The Northwestern's defense is going to have some success, because it's not going to be kind of playing catch up, I don't think, for Northwestern offensively throughout the course of the day. So if that were to happen, how do they get it done? And what are your biggest concerns for the Wildcats defense in this matchup? You had referenced missed tackles, so I'd imagine that's high on the list.
Yeah, definitely starts with just wrapping up the ball carrier, and a team like Penn State, when you have Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, you have to understand, you have to stop the run. And I think Penn State's receiver room, probably not a super potent unit. Of course, Keandre Lambert-Smith has to be a focal point with his blazing speed for a Northwestern secondary that's held up pretty decently for the most part. There have been some coverage busts throughout the year, but I feel like Garnett Hollis Jr. will probably be lined up against Lambert-Smith for much of this game. Theron Johnson opposite him has definitely had some weaker moments and hasn't been as consistent. So I feel like Northwestern kind of needs to hone in on stopping the run, maybe even putting 7 or 8 in the box. And it's going to need guys like Rod Hurd, kind of the slot cornerback, Ozmo, who I mentioned at safety, Devin Turner at safety, to come up and actually stop these ball carriers in their tracks, because there was a run on 4th and 1 by Darius Taylor, the star freshman from Minnesota. Northwestern had him stopped right there behind the line of scrimmage. He just broke one tackle, kind of shoved it off, ran right to the end zone, and it was a back-breaking play for the Wildcats defense. And you can only get away with doing that so many times against a team like Penn State, which doesn't turn the ball over, and which has, of course, the quarterback in Drew Aller, who has flashed his talent for sure this year, and probably a better quarterback than Northwestern fans are used to seeing from Penn State in the last few years.
If you were to identify an X factor for Northwestern in this matchup that maybe could swing the pendulum of them being competitive and putting Penn State on upset alert, or seeing this one really get out of hand on its home turf, what would you say that is?
I would point to probably 2 players on offense. You mentioned the rushing attack with Cam Porter has really not gotten going for much of this year. And I don't think Northwestern wants the game plan to be for Ben Bryant to continue to test this really ferocious secondary with Johnny Dixon and Kalen King. And I don't know that Northwestern's receivers really are going to be able to separate very well against this secondary. So if not a lot of options are open downfield, that's when Bryant could get into some trouble. And as I referenced earlier, he really hasn't been super sharp on those really deep throws. So even if someone gets open down the field like an AJ Henning, Bryant has to be able to hit those throws if Northwestern's going to pass a lot. But that's why I think there needs to be more balance. Northwestern needs to be able to make it less lopsided in the time of possession battle. And that's where the run game can start to be a factor. We've seen Joseph Hyman II get some carries, but it really comes down to whether or not Cam Porter has room to run. And when he does have room, how many tackles is he breaking? He's looked pretty strong for the most part this year. Not a lot of defenders have brought him down on first carry a ton, but he's also not the most explosive runner, doesn't have the quickest first step. So I think it's going to rely a lot on Cam Porter. And then I'd also go to AJ Henning, the receiver. He's definitely had some productive moments in his early Northwestern career after coming over from the Wolverines, was former Gatorade Player of the Year in Illinois. He's found the end zone, I believe, 3 times, including last week, as I mentioned, against Minnesota. But I think he's going to need to generate some type of field flipping play, whether it's an explosive punt return, which he hasn't really done so far as a Wildcat, or a deep shot that he and Bryant connect on if he somehow gets past the back end of that Penn State secondary. I feel like Henning is going to need to touch the ball a lot, whether it's through the pass, whether it's through the run on jet sweeps. But I think Henning needs probably to rip off at least a 20, 30-yard play, something that gets Northwestern into Penn State territory more than once if the Wildcats really want to have a chance in this one.
All right, Bradley, we appreciate the perspective. It's prediction time. We're about to give our breakdown of the Penn State side of things here, but how do you see this one playing out for Northwestern on Saturday afternoon, and ultimately, what is your score prediction?
I think this is a Northwestern team that's definitely a little scrappy, a bit tenacious, but as I have alluded to, I just really don't think Northwestern can compete with a team as talented as Penn State. The Wildcats would need probably lots of mistakes from Penn State in order to really have a chance in this game. Probably multiple turnovers, which that's asking a lot considering PSU has not had any through 4 games. And even last year's game, 17-7, it was just a total slog, as you noted. The rain was coming down in droves. And don't get me wrong, Northwestern's defense played pretty well against the run, but forcing fumbles when the ball is that slick is a much different animal than doing it in probably an 80-degree, pretty perfect day from Ryan Field. So I feel like Northwestern's defense is going to have a big problem stopping the run and even defending a guy like Lambert Smith. I think there will be opportunities for Aller to kind of hang in the pocket. I don't think Northwestern's going to get much pressure going up against Olufashano and this Penn State offensive line. Then on the flip side, I think Northwestern's offense is really going to have a hard day at the office. Going up against one of the best defenses in the country, I think the tackles, especially Caleb Tiernan and Josh Thompson, are in for a rough go of it against Abdul Carter, Chop Robinson, Adisa Isaac. The litany of talent from Penn State's defensive line. And I think what Penn State can do is really take away the receivers for Northwestern, which is kind of the one strength on this offense. So I have Penn State 37, Northwestern 7. I think Brendan Sullivan maybe gets in the end zone, the backup quarterback in garbage time, but should be pretty lopsided unless Penn State commits lots of unforced errors.
Bradley Locker does a great job covering Northwestern Wildcats football for Inside NU. You've had more high points through 4 weeks than you expected, like you said. We'll see if that continues on Saturday against the Nittany Lions. It's a tall task. Appreciate all of your perspective from out in Evanston, and our guys will see you out there in the press box if you'll be up there.
Absolutely, yeah. Look forward to it, and thanks so much for having me on.
All right. We'll move over to the Penn State part of the equation here for the remainder of the show, because the number 6 Nittany Lions looking to improve to 5-0 before that bye week hits, and then returning home for UMass, and then Big Ten play opening right back up on the road at Ohio State. Let's start to break those things down with Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan back here on the Lions247 Podcast. What's going on, guys?
Nothing much. It's a beautiful day, and it looks like it's going to be a beautiful weekend in Chicago. So it's I'm really looking forward to this one.
How about young Bradley Locker? Wow, that kid is plugged in. Great job.
We know how to find him here. I mean, when we got to go outside of the network this year, we're 2 for 2. Big booms with the Delaware coverage, and now with this coverage from Northwestern. So we appreciate that. We're gonna have to go find somebody for UMass. If you have a suggestion out there in the podcast universe, send us your suggestion there. Otherwise, we'll track somebody down, and then when Big Ten play resumes, we'll be locked and loaded with our 24/7 sports experts across conference campuses. But guys, let's get into it with some of the takeaways from the last 48 hours or so since we last sat down for a podcast. And I think we'll go right back to what we did just about 30-40 minutes ago, which was sit down for a phone call, a Zoom call with Marcus Hagans, wide receivers coach in his first year with Penn State. And this is a position group that among all of them on the roster will probably have spent the most time on this podcast discussing, in terms of wondering what it's going to look like when this team is firing on all cylinders offensively, and really in the second half of the season after that UMass game and after this bye week, and who's going to really be on the rise. And Daniel, I'm curious, you were documenting this call, kind of the play-by-play of it for our people on the board at Lions247.com and our VIP subscribers. So what stood up to you from the conversation before we get to some of the takeaways on individual guys? What do you think were some overarching themes from Marcus Hagans?
I think that we're continuing to hear the same refrain that we've heard with the wide receiver group dating back to, I guess, the spring, in terms of looking for that consistency, wanting guys to show up on a daily, weekly, nightly basis, and be able to contribute to the team. Marcus Hagans has really harped on that. I think the last couple of times we've talked to him since, I believe we talked to him once in August after a practice, he's led it. He's mentioned a couple guys being consistent, but when he talks about, when he's asked about specific players, but when he's talking about that group as a whole, he does bring up the consistency. That's something that he's really looking to see. He wants to see better blocking on the outside. That was something that came up today in terms of springing the running backs for some more explosive gains. So I think that this is a group that has some work to do on Saturdays in terms of really making its mark. I think that Marcus Hagans knows that. So we'll see how that shines through. But I think that Marcus Hagans, he knows what this group needs to do. He also knows kind of how the games are going. in terms of what opportunities they have. So, I'm curious to see what this ends up looking like on Saturday.
Mark, you were on that call too, and I let it off by asking about Keandre Lambert-Smith, and Marcus Higgins talked about the consistency. They just keep stacking it and stacking it and stacking it, and I think thus far Keandre Lambert-Smith has certainly looked the part, and the snaps reflect that. But beyond him, we have such a collection, and Daniel and I were talking about this on Tuesday. It's just kind of a revolving door thus far, and you're not quite sure who are the 3 or 4 outside of Liam Clifford, who's getting his allotment in the slot. He's playing about probably 50% or 40% of the total snaps there in the slot, and other people are filling in the rest. But Mark, who are you most curious about? I mean, it's a deep list. Harrison Wallace, Omari Evans, some of the homegrown talent. You got Malik Mega. Maybe we'll see him back after 3-game absence. He was involved at practice. But then you've got the transfers. Malik McLean, it's been kind of a roller coaster ride for him. And then Dante Cephas, who's had a steady uptick in snap count, but not that uptick in production at this point. Who is the guy that you think maybe could be that dynamite that could be lit? And by the time we get into mid-October or even early November, they're on a different level in terms of how we view this offense.
Yeah, I think without question, Trey Wallace. I mean, this is a guy that the coaching staff was talking up, and we had heard a lot of really good things about through camp, but he's been bumped up. If he's healthy, that's another 1A type receiver. I mean, obviously, it was good that you asked about Keandre first, because he talked about the consistency, as you mentioned, but that very consistency, as Daniel noted, is what's missing from everybody else. And when we went into this season, what were we saying? We're saying one of the real keys for this receiving core is to not have that one guy who has all of these catches, and then your next receiver is 20, 30 catches or whatever behind. And right now, that's what we're trending at. I mean, Keandre Lambert-Smith with 21, Harrison Wallace with 10. And again, part of that is because he's been banged up, but I just think you need more consistency across the board. So beyond Harrison Wallace, the 2 guys that I really think have an opportunity to do some things, and this isn't a knock on Liam Clifford, because I think he's been good in his role. But I really think Cephas, what we saw from him, it wasn't a lot last week, but the burst that we saw from him, and that was somebody else that Marcus Higgins talked about today, the fact that, and I think you may have asked him about him as well. One of you guys asked him about it, but he's 9-10 weeks in being at Penn State. People have to remember he was not a mid-year arrival. This guy didn't arrive until the summer, and he's still learning. And what Higgins said is, it's his best days are going to be ahead of him. And I think what we saw athletically from him, and the fact that they had the confidence to go with him as a starter when Wallace was banged up and Malik McLean obviously struggled against Illinois. He's one guy. And then the other guy is Caden Saunders. Again, just from what I know he had a bit of a rough game returning punts, but I like the wiggle we're seeing out of him. I like the kind of the juice that he's bringing. So those are 2 guys that I would really look, to how much are their roles going to expand? I don't know. I don't know if they're going to keep trying to get as many receivers as possible in there, but those are 2 guys beyond Harrison Wallace, who I think Harrison Wallace is the guy that they need to step up. But then those other 2 guys are the ones I would be looking for.
And a reminder that you had Tyler Warren and Theo Johnson playing as many snaps as Keandre Lambert-Smith last week, and then there's a gulf between all them and all the other pass catchers. So you've got those 2 tight ends carving into those opportunities. And I think the little bit of recency bias here, because I'm with you on Dante Cephas, and I do think we kept hearing from Marcus Higgins, hammering it in his answer there. His best days of football are ahead of him. His best days of football are ahead of him. And you do have to remember, not having those 15 spring practices under his belt with this quarterback and this offensive scheme and this wide receivers coach, that's going to set you back no matter how much experience you have at whatever level of football you played before this. So we haven't seen him step up and look like a starting caliber talent with routine yet this season. But I'll tell you what, sometimes you can't look too far in the starting lineups for this team. But if he's in that starting lineup again for a second week in a row, that to me is notable, because it shows that he's sustained something here for a second consecutive week, and they're going into a bye week. So it's a chance for him to really maybe do something with that role. But if we see Harrison Wallace back as the starter opposite of Keandre Lambert-Smith, then that tells us that he's in a really good spot from a health standpoint. A couple weeks ago, he was cleared to play medically. The Penn State coaching staff didn't think he would be where he needed to be to help them go score points. Last week was a different story, but he was in a second team role. So it looks like a stepping stones thing rather than him just being right back to where they wanted. And then if it's somebody else, whether it's an Omari Evans or Malik McClain, then it's kind of like, all right, well, this is it's a revolving door at that starting position. And it's kind of just, no one has really asserted themselves there. So we'll keep tabs on that. I think it's worth noting here that while there's some questions at receiver, there's been some reinforced sentiment that this offensive line is on the right track, Daniel Gallen, because I think we wanted to get through a few games here. We really wanted to get through these first couple Big Ten matchups against teams that wanted to attack Penn State in ways that were really going to challenge this offensive line in a substantial way for 60 minutes of football. And it may have taken 3 quarters or 2.5 quarters in both instances, but this unit of 7 guys or sometimes 8 guys or 9 guys has broken down that barrier. That rushing game has gotten going late in games. They've put away contests, and they've protected Drew Aller along the way. 1 sack allowed. They got the Joe Moore recognition this week, which goes to an offensive line unit on a weekly basis. I know that's an award that even when they've been mentioned as nominees for in past years, James Franklin has brought it up in press conferences. So there's some pride there. And then some words that I heard from Salim Wormley, and I think you may have been on the call as well, Daniel. He talked about grinding out that game. And while as much as it sounds great to go and have a 1-2 play possession where you have a bomb touchdown and you're celebrating on the sidelines, he described the process of going 12, 14, 15 plays, and you're out there sweating, you're breathing hard, you're tired with your brothers out there, but at the end of it, you're in the end zone, and you see the look of the defenders' faces, and they just couldn't stop you. They did everything they could, and they could not. And that's just a way of playing football that we have not really heard from offensive line interviews on this campus since I've been covering the team. The wheels are turning in the right direction still. I think we can confirm that, Daniel.
Yeah, it was kind of funny to hear Wormley say that because I talked to him after the season opener, and I asked him what it was like to be on the field for the 72-yard touchdown pass to Keandre Lambert-Smith, and Wormley said, "Oh yeah, it was great because we didn't have to finish the drive. We just got to go right to the sideline." But I think we've talked about it a lot where we really haven't seen Penn State win games like this. And the way that they're grinding it out, it's not really a slog. I heard Bradley Locker talk about that Northwestern game last year, the 17-7 game. I mean, I think you can make the case that Penn State grinded that one out, but it was not pretty, not pleasant, not efficient. But the way that they've been doing it so far has been kind of the opposite, where you're not getting those big plays, but they're efficient. They're moving the chains. They're getting themselves into these 3rd and manageables, 4th and manageables, where they can keep drives going. And I think that we're just really seeing a Penn State team that is exerting its will over opponents. And I think that James Franklin has really noticed. Phil Troutwine has really noticed. I think that the guys on the rest of the team have really noticed. You asked James Franklin on Wednesday night, I think, about giving the Player of the Week award to those 7 starting offensive linemen, and James Franklin said that this isn't a participation trophy thing. It's not a feel good thing. That they're giving that honor to guys that they really saw step up and really make big plays. So I think that there is something different about this offensive line this year. Maybe it's being at this point under Phil Troutwine in terms of recruiting and development. Maybe it's just having a veteran group. Maybe JV Nelson has just added a lot of nastiness to that unit. But it is really, really showing through. And I think that for so long, the question about Penn State was always, are the Lions going to be able to hold up? Are the Lions going to be able to hold up? Especially in the post-sanctions era when Franklin first got here. So to see them to be at this point and making this type of impact, I think that it really shows the growth. And I think through the recognition from Franklin, through that Joe Moore recognition, it's kind of, putting things on notice that, this offensive line, is here, and it's one that can be successful.
Couple more quick notes from that conversation with Salim Wormley. He was quick to point out that he was surprised to feel as fresh as he does right now in the final week of September after playing 4 football games and these methodical drives the way they have. He says they are noticing that this rotation is having an impact. He says they hope they keep it up because it just feels different late in games. It feels different when they're recovering from games. And Venga Ioane is a third starting guard. So you've got 3 guys sharing that wealth with JB Nelson and then Salim Wormley, of course. And Drew Shelton's going to continue to get his work as that third tackle, and others will be sprinkled in as well. But Franklin identifying those as 7 starters. And then I think Salim Wormley also said something that caught my attention for sure was he said it felt like his center is never left from last year. He feels like he still has the same center in this offense, and that was a huge compliment to Hunter Norzad because, losing Juice Scruggs, who played at as high a level, I think, at that position of anyone in this conference, moving on in the second round NFL draft pick, Hunter Norzad has filled that seamlessly by a lot of accounts in terms of his accountability within the game and making decisions, making the right calls. And he is pointed to routinely as one of the, if not the toughest member of this offensive line, which is a good characteristic for your center who's got to stick up for that young quarterback at times. So I think they're on a really good track right now. And of course, when they're playing this way, you look to the ground game. I think it may surprise some folks right now. I know I was a bit surprised. They rank second in the Big Ten Conference right now in rushing yards per game. There are 210 yards on the ground per contest, 4.4 yards per carry overall with 10 touchdowns. That's the second highest scoring total on the ground as well this season. And meanwhile, you'll find Northwestern in the basement, Mark Brennan, when it comes to their rush defense. They're giving up almost 190 on the ground, 9 touchdowns thus far through 4 matchups. And they haven't faced the Penn State offense quite yet, or the Nick Singletons and Katron Allens of the world. To me, this feels like every opportunity for that feel-good breakout party you want to see from this backfield right before you get into a bye week. You put them in bubble wrap again, and then you unleash them on the Big Ten for the second half of play.
Yeah, I was tempted to just revisit my bold prediction from last week and just make it this week's bold prediction, but I did not. But I do think there is something to be said for going into that bye week, getting the ground game into really, really high gear. And I would not be at all surprised if the coaching staff puts this game in the hands of the offensive line and said, listen, guys, we want to grind this thing out again. We want to get out of this thing as healthy as possible. We want to win relatively comfortably if we can. And it's up to you to get the job done. And let's see if they could do it, because listen, this is shaping up as the deepest offensive line they've had since that great 1994 one. Now, I'm not putting it in that category, but I think when you have this level of starters and this level of depth, the things that they're going to be able to do when they get into tough games, and that's why I think it's important to, in this game, have that running game, just really cranking up, because there's going to come a time, and we've seen it how many times when they've played in Ohio State and they've had a lead and they've been unable to put that game away because the ground game wasn't working. And I think building, yeah, they're going to talk about one game at a time, going 1-0, that's all great. But I think being able to get the confidence level to the point where that if you get to that spot, and that's what I loved about that game last week. I mean, everybody was like, no explosive plays. Well, yeah, I mean, of course you would have preferred to have some explosive plays, but the fact was you didn't get them, and yet you still just beat that team into oblivion, running 97 plays overall. That gigantic field goal drive, that was 17 plays or whatever the hell it was. I mean, those things are all positive signs moving forward. And again, the way the schedule breaks down, I thought I mentioned it earlier this week. I thought it would have been great if Penn State would have been facing Ohio State this week, but that's not the way the schedule works. So now you have Northwestern, you have a bye, and you have UMass. The goal now is to get to that Ohio State game as healthy as possible. And I think putting this game in the hands of the offensive line is going to allow them to do that.
To your point, I think we have seen this offense show its put-away ability with the ground game. Late in games, you want to see them, like you said, hand the ball to them in the first quarter on the first drive and say, march it down the field or zip down the field, whatever you got to do on the ground, set the tone early. That hasn't been the case thus far. They've done it with the passing game sometimes early in games. it's taken a little while to set the tone like last time they hit the road in the Big Ten. We'll find out soon enough out in Evanston. Meanwhile, as the offensive line is out there sweating and working their way through these games, you got the defense able to enjoy the view and watch Drew Aller put in a lot of work this season because everyone will tell you, James Franklin down to the defensive players, they've essentially wiped out a game's worth of work through 1 month of this season because of the snap count. James Franklin put it at 86 fewer snaps than this time at the point when they were 4-0 in 2022. And so, Daniel, obviously we're thinking down the road this is going to pay off from a health standpoint, but each week the imagination of Manny Diaz shows up in something a little bit different. I am really curious to see what exactly he wants to put out, not just to mess with Northwestern and put them in a terrible position and keep the avalanche of takeaways going, but just to put out there for a couple of weeks for other opposing staffs to have to parse through about what Penn State is bringing to the football field these days with their defense.
Yeah, I'm curious if we'll see that. Well, actually, I think we'll see a lot of the three defensive end package that we saw last week. I mean, when you factor in that Northwestern has thrown the ball decently well this year. I think James Franklin said that Ben Bryant is probably the best pure passer that they've seen this year, and you assume that the Penn State defense is going to get Northwestern into some 3rd and longs, so you can really pin your ears back and make some things happen. I think that you have some intriguing matchups in terms of the cornerbacks and the Northwestern wide receivers too. But the one element that I am curious to see how it develops, how it grows over these next couple of weeks is that 4 linebacker package. I think when I went through and rewatched those defensive snaps again, thank you Iowa for making it easy to watch every single defensive snap. We only saw it 3 times. And it led to 2 Iowa incompletions and then the Cade McNamara scramble or bootleg for 18 yards, which on a call with Curtis Jacobs on Wednesday, he brought that up himself and took full responsibility, for misplaying that to lead there. But yeah, I think that when we saw that, I think the first place that a lot of people's heads went was to Michigan, and being in a pounded out game like that, I am really curious to see how that look evolves. And, I'm with you. I mean, is Manny Diaz going to put anything else on tape in terms of different packages, different blitzes, different formations? We've talked to some of these defensive players and, they are having a really, really good time playing for Diaz. And, I think the word fun has really come up a lot. And he's just putting these guys in positions to get turnovers and, get success. So, I'm curious to see what this looks like. I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities for turnovers this week, whether that's, through interceptions or meeting at the quarterback for a strip sack. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
I think it's really interesting what you mentioned there about the cornerback wide receiver matchup. We can get into that a little bit later. I as we get to our players of the game, because it does feel like that's a definitive issue for Northwestern. If that's what they rely upon thus far, is attacking that perimeter, going downfield, testing teams vertically, or trying to come back that way. This is not the Penn State team to be tested in that manner. Penn State really hasn't had to rely on an infusion of newcomers thus far. I mean, you think back to where they were at the end of September last year. You had guys emerging all over the field in year 1 with the program. You had Mitchell Tinsley as a starting guy entrenched in your starting lineup. You had a couple running backs on their rise, obviously, in Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. Across the field, Abdul Carter, I don't think he had started a game yet, but what he ended up accomplishing. You had multiple guys on the defensive front burning red shirt. And now I think you assess the situation here and you say, well, Penn State's doing it with relatively the same team that we saw wrap up the season last year in the Rose Bowl. Now, Drew Aller, who was in mop-up duty out there in Pasadena, now has the keys to the car as the starting quarterback. But it was just something that crossed my mind today when I was putting together the rundown for the show, is just how much of the same group that has bridged that gap through the offseason, and now here they are maturing even more. A lot of those guys are already experienced veterans. They're ready to embark on their 2nd or 3rd or even 4th campaign in full-on conference action. And I think it makes me wonder how do those freshmen and transfers who've largely been luxury pieces thus far outside of the special teams unit, where they needed to be the guys at punter and kicker because of competition reasons there. But whether it's at wide receiver with the Cephas or Trey Potts and some of the splashes that he might be able to make. But I think I'm just really impressed by the fact that in college football, where roster changeover is everything now, Mark, and everyone wants the immediate gratification boost. You lost Alonzo Ford to an injury. You're still waiting for some of these transfer wide receivers to really emerge and show up in a big way. The cornerback that you brought in on Davian Collins is going to be a special teams contributor, but that's about it right now. And then a lot of these freshmen have been scattered in special teams coverage units or maxing out at maybe 10 to a dozen snaps in a game. I think that's very exciting for the long-term ceiling in the next 8 games and beyond.
I think the bigger message, though, is the lack of impact players they have who are entering the transfer portal. I think you look at a lot of these schools and it's basically like a revolving door. Okay, you're losing these guys, and then you're going to go over and come to this school and get some players from there. And I think what you're going to see over the next few years, and I know that Colorado is an outlier with this, with the way that Coach Prime has rebuilt that program, and it's been impressive what he did. And it's going to be interesting to see how many people try to follow that model. But I think the teams that are going to be consistently in that college football playoff, or whatever gets to however many teams, are going to be the ones who are able to use the transfer portal to supplement. If you're fortunate enough to bring in a Chop Robinson or an AK, tremendous. But you can't rely on that every single year, because I think you need the structure. And you can see the way guys kind of fit in here. I mean, they've done a really nice job with that. So, yeah, I mean, I think when you could look at it from the perspective of not a lot of new players are making an impact, but I think the other side of that is there wasn't a lot of room, because even with the guys you lost to the NFL, you had so many key players coming back. Going back to your previous point about the Rose Bowl, you had so many key players coming back. And I think that says something about the coaching staff. I mean, we see turnover everywhere. And to have, the limited turnover that they've had among their elite players, among their best players, I think actually says something about the job that James Franklin and his staff and the whole program is doing. Because in this era of NIL, that can't be an easy thing, but they're somehow to date pulling it off.
Yeah, I want to make clear. I'm not saying they didn't bring in talented guys.
Yeah.
They have. We talked about the depth. It's shown up. They've been healthy, and the cool part about this is because of the way that they've blown out teams and the way they've been able to distribute snaps. Is if you are in a situation where you've got to go down your depth chart at cornerback or safety or offensive guard or offensive tackle or defensive end, you've got a guy there who's got some seasoning now. He's got a couple games of some serious run under his belt. And I think we'll continue to see that. I think this Northwestern game is going to be a really good opportunity. If it goes as we think it will, we'll talk about predictions in a few minutes, then it should be another great opportunity for Penn State to not only, pull back the reins on some of those lead horses on this roster and make sure that they get into the bye week healthy, but also to take another look and get some more work for some younger components and some of these other guys. And then like Dante Cephas, you never know when that, moment might come on where a new guy, asserts himself with this program. So
Tyler, one guy we should mention,
Yeah.
Tyler, is Trey Potts.
Yeah.
Because I'm just telling you, knock on wood that everybody stays healthy. But if one of those top running backs gets banged up, I mean, that guy is going to be gold. I mean, he already is contributing on special teams and as a backup and as a leader in that room because he's a veteran guy. But and that's my point, to be able to bring in that caliber of player, I mean, that's like unbelievable when you look at, and again, let's hope that every college football player stays healthy, but we know in reality that's not the case. But if one of those kids gets banged up, I mean, the fact that you have a Trey Potts, I mean, that's like, that is really, really, those are the things that are really, really important for the best teams. In terms of, you want to be able to go in there and compete. We're 2 years removed from that Iowa game where Penn State had a QB go down and had no answer, and it unraveled the entire season. And they're not in that spot now. They're in a good spot with their depth just about everywhere.
Yeah, and then you factor in some guys that we just haven't seen much of at all, and some of those talented running backs, Cam Wallace, London Montgomery, the tight end, Andrew Rappleyea. And you just think about there's a lot of luxury right now involved with Penn State, with where they are from a roster perspective. There are teams across the conference that would need to throw these guys into the fire from the first month and then let them figure it out on the fly. Right now, they're able to do a lot of that with training wheels on the practice field. That's good for program health. That's good for building something. And Daniel, I didn't want to go past this and go right to our other players to watch and our predictions without mentioning Khalil Dinkins in the conversation we had. We're kind of used to hearing from some of the other players. Hakeem Beamon was up with us and Daquan Hardy. And I can tell you after Wednesday practice, they were exuding confidence after watching their film from that last game and what they're building moving forward. I know Hakeem Beamon feels like they really took things up to another level when they got Vanover and Izzard and Hardy back on the football field in week 3. They're starting to really bang their chest a little bit, really trusting in Manny Diaz. You can pick up on all that. We can really pick up on the confidence with this team and within Khalil Dinkins about what he has going on as a redshirt sophomore. You're not going to have Tyler Warren and Theo Johnson forever here. The tight end room moves on. The standard's always very high. We know that there's some young talent within this program. They'll be adding to that next year as well. So Khalil Dinkins is in a really interesting spot here as the kind of in-between man. And thus far, he's answered the bell as not just tight end 3, but as a versatile piece in that, the T formation, as he loved to always point out to us and tweet. And then we also get to see him hit the end zone on a big 4th down catch. What stood out from the conversation with the young man whose father spent about a decade in the NFL at the tight end role?
Yeah, I think Khalil Dinkins factors into a little bit of what Mark was talking about earlier in terms of not needing to go into the transfer portal to, a lot and kind of the depth. I think that it's a testament to how the personnel staff and the coaching staff has recruited and developed where, you look at, kind of the draft picks who left last year where, Jair Brown leaves. And then you look at, they have all these safeties that they can choose from, to fill that role. Joey Porter Jr. leaves. You've got Johnny Dixon and Cam Miller waiting. Brenton Strange leaves. Theo Johnson, Tyler Warren, Khalil Dinkins. I think that it really speaks to, what Penn State has been able to do. I think wide receiver is the exception there, and you saw them go into the portal to try to fill in for Parker Washington and Mitchell Tinsley. So I just wanted to highlight that there. But, going back to Khalil Dinkins, it was, nice to talk to him and to hear from him because he's someone that I think is, kind of on a borderline of having a really, really big role. We saw Penn State really rotate last year with Strange, Warren, and Johnson. I think that looking at, I don't have the season snap counts in front of me, but I don't think there's been quite as much Dinkins as the 3rd tight end getting worked in outside of, the T and a couple other 13 personnel packages. And, he said that, but he said that the fact that they're using so much 12 personnel just speaks to the confidence that they have in that room, in those tight ends. He said that it was a really good feeling to have Drew Aller's trust on a 4th down play, to go to him for a touchdown. I think that we saw last year, he caught that touchdown pass from Aller in the Ohio game. So those are 2 guys that have really had a chance to work together. And, you talked about Khalil Dinkins' father who played in the NFL. Khalil Dinkins is playing with his brother, Colin, a cornerback who has been able to really carve out a role on special teams. I mean, I think that I'd have to go back and look at those kickoff coverage teams, but he might be the only walk-on or one of only 2 walk-ons who's been able to crack that depth chart there. And Khalil Dinkins said that he always tries to keep his brother motivated. He knows how hard it is, like that. I think Khalil Dinkins is very aware of who the other cornerbacks are in that room and what it might be like to be at the bottom of that food chain. But he said that he is just having a fun time, watching his brother and everything. And he brought up the T formation. We had a lot of questions to Dinkins about that, and he said that he had a nice one-liner asked about why does it seem like the Penn State fans are really like that formation or are always excited when they see it out on the field. And he said that, well, it's usually because when it's on the field that they're going to score, that when it's out there, and we saw it last year, they don't even have to be near the end zone to put that out there to score with guys like Nick Singleton. So, Dinkins said that he just put in a lot of hard work in this offseason When they knew Brenton Strange was leaving, and that left that vacancy in the middle of the T, but also on the depth chart. And Dinkins said that he just really went out and tried to earn that spot by grinding it out, and his coaches recognized that. So I think that he's someone that we could see more of as the season goes on. Especially if the wide receiver depth chart doesn't necessarily develop, the way that it should or that Penn State might need it to. But I think that he's someone who knows his role. Every time he goes out there, he knows he's going to get the opportunity to make a play. So he's really trying to make the most of it.
Let's talk about some other players on this squad, guys. Players to watch: Penn State versus Northwestern on Saturday. Mark, we're going to let you lead off this. We'll work our way to Daniel, and then I'll finish off with my player.
I tipped my hand a little bit earlier by saying I think it'd be wise for the coaching staff to put this game in the hands of the offensive line. And I'm going to go with somebody who kind of personifies that in Hunter Norzad. So I know that's thinking outside of the box a little bit, but I really do. Keep your eye on that offensive line, and let's see if they're able to continue what they established against Iowa. I think that would be a really good sign for this program going into the bye week and then into the following week scrimmage against UMass. So that is my player to watch. Hunter Norzad, kind of representing that entire offensive line.
Norzad was the staff's pick for player of the week on offense last time they hit the road against Illinois, and then he took part in sharing that honor this past game against Iowa. Daniel, what do you got for us?
I'm going to stick on the theme of our call earlier today with Marcus Hagans and go with Dante Cephas. I think the fact that we saw him get into the starting lineup, we saw him get a bunch of reps against Iowa. It seems like the arrow is pointing up for him. And I think that it's probably only a matter of time before we see a big play from him, by the time and then we see, what we saw on that Kent State film translate over to the Big Ten. I think this is a good opportunity to do that, for Penn State to try to hit on some explosive plays. And I assume that Dante Cephas is going to have plenty of opportunities to make that happen.
Ben Bryant has played a ton of football at the quarterback for Northwestern, and going back to 2021, he doesn't have a lot of multi-interception games, but I think he's going to get tagged with one today. He's only got 2 multi-interception games. Again, he's playing every week since the start of 2021 season. Kalen King is where I'm going here. I think Ben Bryant, this passing attack, they're going to be feeling pretty good about themselves, and I think early on it makes sense for them considering what we know about this matchup, what we know about Penn State. Why not air it out a little bit? See if you can keep connect on some sparks early in this game. I think Northwestern's coaching staff, they should be very aware that it's important for them to establish as much carryover from that excitement last time they were on the football field into the early stages of this game. We've talked about it potentially being a snooze fest. Mark, you sent a really interesting text to us yesterday. 38,000 combined fans for the first couple home games at Northwestern. Penn State's played in front of an average of 109,000 fans a week in their home stadium. So you're at risk of Penn State kind of being like, whoa, wake me up after the first quarter. So can Northwestern take advantage of that? And I think, can they lean on their passing game? Ben Bryant's going to test it out. I think the answer will be resounding no. And Kalen King will finally get some of those targets that he's been asking for the last few weeks. And I think he'll come down with an interception. I don't know if they'll look his way much more than that, but just his ability, whether he's coming down with an interception or not, to essentially shut down a quadrant of the field for this passing attack is going to be so demoralizing for them. They don't have the talent to really respond to that. Penn State has the supplemental pieces in this defensive secondary and the pass rush to, I think, to make it a long day for Bryant and force him in one of those uncharacteristic multi-turnover games. He did throw a couple picks in his Big Ten starting debut at Rutgers in week 1. And bold predictions, regular predictions. Daniel, you're going to lead us off this time around. Spoiler alert: we're all going for Penn State to enter the bye week unscathed.
Oh man, I was really wanted some suspense there with my pick. I'll start with the bold prediction. We've talked about this Northwestern run defense not being that good, and being something that Penn State should really be able to take advantage of, especially based on how the offensive line is playing. So for bold prediction, I've got Nick Singleton going for 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. Both of those touchdowns will be from at least 25 yards. and Katron Allen will tack on another 80 yards and a touchdown of his own. Even though I did just pick a wide receiver as a player to watch, I do think that this game will be dictated on the ground. And I think that Penn State has the horses to really, really make that happen. And I think that that'll lead to a final score of 40-10.
Mark, what do you have for us?
Yeah, I'm sticking with the ground game as well, but I'm going in a little different direction. I don't know that anybody's going to rack up that many yards individually. I'm saying that 4 different Penn State ball carriers are going to score touchdowns, and one of them is going to be a wide receiver. I think we'll see a little bit of trickeration just because, they want to keep Keandre Lambert-Smith, keep him focused and make sure you get him the ball in different ways. They tried it last week. It didn't really work, but I think they'll go back to it maybe on some sort of inside sweep or something, and you have 4 different players score rushing touchdowns. With respect to the score, I watched a lot of the Northwestern Minnesota game. That was 31-10 with just over 12 minutes to go, and that's a pretty bad Minnesota team. So all respect to Northwestern for clawing its way back and showing the fight, but this is a decidedly not bad Penn State team, and I just don't think Northwestern has the horses to stay up to speed. Don't know that it's going to be an immediate blowout. I know a lot of us are talking about the 11 a.m. kick, 20,000 fans, whatever it's going to be, but I look at Penn State cruising 38-7.
Yep. I'm pretty close to the margin with you guys. I'll get to that in a second. I'll start with my bold prediction. I think that explosive play conversation at least gets put on ice for a little bit. I'm sure we'll pick it back up before the Ohio State matchup eventually, but I think the explosive plays show up in this game from both the running game and the passing game. 3 touchdowns that go 25 plus yards combined. 3 different Nittany Lions doing that. I think that'd be great to see. You want to look at what you want to see this team kind of going into the bye week doing. You'd like to get some more highlights on that reel of guys going long distance. And Nick Singleton, you're looking at him in this game specifically with Northwestern's issues tackling, wrapping up. And you can look at both running backs, but I think we're all been curious. Nick Singleton, we're getting a little bit deeper into year number 2, and that haven't been part of his highlight package thus far. Does that change this Saturday? I think it does. For a final score going 45-10, Penn State, again, I think multiple turnovers forced for the 4th consecutive game. And ultimately, Penn State really looks the part. This might be a game where we're getting close to halftime and the fans are grumbling and our message board's a little bit grumpy and they're waiting for the Nittany Lions to really pour it on. And I think by the time you get to the final score and you look at the final stat sheet, you say, well, yeah, that's really what it should look like. 45-10, Penn State handling its business, heading to the bye week. You guys will be out in Evanston covering this matchup. I guess it'll be breakfast or brunch out in the press box, whatever it is. I hope they take good care of you. And we'll catch up with Daniel on the post-game podcast Saturday. And, of course, everyone at Lions247 can follow our coverage before, during, after the game. But this is a game that you're going to want to follow before. They got the travel roster restrictions, so we'll be curious to see who gets left behind on campus. And then the status report pregame relatively early in the morning on Saturday. But guys, thanks for breaking things down here with the preview on the podcast. Get out there safe, and we'll talk to you real soon.
Sounds good. Look forward to it. Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right. Good stuff from Daniel and Mark. And before that, Bradley Locker of Inside NU, who gave us a great lowdown on the Northwestern Wildcats. Penn State versus Northwestern, noon kickoff here on Saturday. Again, full coverage. We've had it all week. We'll have it throughout the remainder of this game week at Lions247.com, where you've also had a ton of whiteout coverage still coming out from a recruiting perspective. I think Tyler Calvaruso finally went to bed after 3 or 4 straight days of not doing that, but he earned some slumber. So did Brian Doan, and I encourage folks. I know it can get lost in the shuffle a little bit here with the episodes, and we have 4 of them during the weeks now in season, but Brian Doan broke down Penn State's post-whiteout recruiting success with us for about a half hour on our Tuesday episode of this podcast. So the national recruiting analyst with 24/7 Sports, the best in the business. Give that a listen if you want to know what's going on in the recruiting world for the Nittany Lions right now, including comprehensive breakdowns of each of their 3 new commitments that have come on board with that 2025 class. On behalf of everyone at 24/7 Sports, Penn State Hub at Lions 24/7, I'm Tyler Donahue. Thanks for listening to the Lions 24/7 podcast.